Right, well, thank you all for coming and welcome to the second of these lectures. Great Christian composers, their life, their faith, their music. Now, the first lecture was a bit different from all the others in as much as we didn't focus on one particular composer. We looked at the Reformation, we looked at its effects on a number of different composers about whose lives we probably don't know as much as we do about composers from later period. But we saw how they were touched as God moved in that remarkable way in the 16th century. And we saw how some of the changes that occurred, particularly in the way that worship was conducted in the evangelical churches as emerged from the Reformation, some of those issues are very relevant to us today. Anyway, as we move on to these remaining four lectures, they will all focus on the life and the music and the faith of a single individual. And the first person we'll be considering is Heinrich Schütz, perhaps not a name that's so well known as the three composers we'll be considering later on, but certainly someone to whose music I was introduced when I was at school, and I've loved it ever since. You'll notice from his dates that he did live to quite a great age. He lived to celebrate his 87th birthday, and you consider the different world, certainly different musical world, between 1585 and 1672. He was born the year that Thomas Tallis died. Thomas Tallis, who a couple of his hymn tunes are in our hymn book. He's also famous for writing a lot of other things, including the incredible 40-part motet Speminalium. But he began his musical career before the start of the English Reformation in the days of Henry VIII. In Schütz's childhood, the great figures from the late Renaissance choral music period were very much still in operation. Palestrina in Italy, Orlando di Lasso, who was quite a widely travelled composer who worked in a number of different countries, Thomas Luis de Victoria, one of Spain's greatest composers, and in England, William Byrd. That's the world of 1585. Fast forward to 1672, and it's a very different picture indeed. You've got in France Jean-Baptiste Lully, Louis XIV's court composer, and Marc-Antoine Charpentier. In Germany, you've got Dietrich Buxtehude in Lübeck, who Bach walked 200 miles to hear play and to meet, as we'll see when we look at Bach later on. In Italy, Arcangelo Corelli, the great maestro of the violin. I'm so grateful that my parents didn't call me Archangel. I don't think I'd be able to live up to a name like that. And in England, a young teenage lad called Henry Purcell was just about to start writing his first compositions at the time that Schütz died. So that's a totally different world musically. So it's a long, long life that he lived, and a very productive life at that. He was born in Köstritz in Thuringia in Germany. His father was an innkeeper and quite a prosperous man. And in fact, to the point that when Schütz was still a child, he was able to move to Weissenfels and buy a larger inn. In fact, he bought two inns. He obviously was quite a successful innkeeper, quite a prosperous man. And that is the house, I believe, in Weissenfels that his father owned where Schütz grew up. Here's a map to those people, including myself, who aren't terribly familiar with that part of the world. There is Weissenfels there, and there is Dresden, which is where Schütz spent a great part of his life. And quite interestingly, it's a part of the world from which several of the other composers will be considered all had connections. Halle there in the top left-hand corner being the birthplace of Handel, and where is it? Somewhere on the map. I'm trying to find it. There is Leipzig, where Bach spent his last 27 years, and also where Mendelssohn died. So it's quite interesting how that particular part of Germany was very prominent really in the development of German music over the period. Right, and it's quite interesting that even though he may not be such a well-known name over here, the Germans have known him and loved his music for quite some time. He was born exactly 100 years before Bach and Handel. In 1585, they were born in 1675. And this is a set of stamps that was issued in 1985 to mark the 300th and 400th anniversaries of their birth. And it's interesting enough, you'll see that it says DDR there, the former East Germany. That part of Germany was part of East, was actually in the communist East until German unification. So that's where he started life, that part of the world. And he was obviously quite a bright lad. Just go back. But the turning point in his life was the fact that an important guest decided to stay in his father's house, Landgrave Moritz of Hesse-Kassel. Now, Germany in those days may have been united in terms of its language and to some extent in its culture, although it was split along religious lines. But politically, it was not a single country as it is now. It was split up into various different principalities, nominally, for the most part, I think, if not the whole part of the Holy Roman Empire, but fairly decentralised in its structure. There were a number of different nobles. This was a sort of fairly middle-ranking nobleman. But anyway, he turned up at this inn. He heard young Heinrich sing and was very impressed with his singing, and asked if he could be taken over to Kassel in his court and become one of the singers. Now, his parents were none too keen on this idea, and it took quite a lot of persuasion before eventually in 1599, when he was 14 years old, they let him go. So he moved away from his parents' house in Weissenfels to Kassel, and he sang in the choir for several years until his voice broke. But he was actually given quite a wide education, not just in music. He, as I said, clearly was a very bright lad and continued his education there, and then went on to Marburg, where he studied law. So you might have thought, well, after this brief interlude in music, that's the end of it for Heinrich Schütz, but not at all. Moritz intervened again and recommending, and this is Schütz's own words, that a truly celebrated but quite old musician was living in Italy, and I should not miss the opportunity to hear him and learn from him. And so in 1609, he went to Venice to study with Giovanni Gabrieli, and he couldn't really have studied under a better person. Now, although there's a lot of questions, in fact, I don't think I fully know the answers. You might ask, well, how come that a Protestant from Germany was allowed to study in Roman Catholic Venice? Obviously, even in spite of the antipathy that Roman Catholic Church had towards Protestants, there were certain occasions where people given safe conduct, Protestants were allowed to study in Catholic countries. And Venice, to be honest, was not as staunchly counter-Reformation extreme, say, as Rome was. In fact, in 1606, the Pope had placed an interdict on the city of Venice. They had a row over who had the right to appoint clergy in the Venetian churches. Now, go back 400 years, and you may know that our country was placed under an interdict by Pope Innocent III in the reign of King John, and the result was absolute chaos. People weren't allowed to be buried, the clergy refused to take services and this sort of thing. It was a disaster. But fast forward 400 years to 1606, and the papacy didn't have the same power. They placed this interdict on Venice, and basically life carried on really without much difference. They didn't take a lot of notice until eventually they resolved their differences amicably. So Venice wasn't really quite under the thumb of the papacy as much as, say, Rome was. And there was a lot of ceremony in the cathedral in Venice, which you'll see a picture of a bit later on. They loved their ceremony. It's very much a sort of civic place as much as a religious place. And so therefore, they wouldn't have... Let me just go back a bit, please, Brandy. There wouldn't have been that much of a problem with a young Protestant coming to study in Venice. Interesting enough, just another brief word about Duke Moritz. He was brought up a Lutheran. There seems to have been quite a convinced believer. But he actually became a Calvinist, which as a German nobleman he wasn't allowed to do. There had been a settlement in the 16th century which allowed Germans to be Catholics or to be Lutherans, but not to be Calvinists. The fact that he decided to make this change suggested that he was someone of real faith. We don't know quite the effect that all this would have had on young Heinrich Schütz. As I mentioned in the first lecture, people that write about these composers don't tend to want to ask the questions that we as Christians would be interested in. How did you become a Christian? What moments in your life did you trust in the Lord Jesus Christ as your Saviour? We can be very confident that Schütz did reach that point. We don't exactly know when. We don't know a lot about the finer details of how he became a Christian. But his Christian faith is very apparent when you study his life and you study his music. Now, in Venice, he and Gabrieli hit it off very well indeed. Gabrieli, by this time, was not in the best of health. He was suffering from kidney stones, which was eventually to lead to his death in 1612. But he was one of the finest composers of the age. Venice liked their ceremonies, the Venetians liked their ceremonies, and Gabrieli was the ideal man to write very grand ceremonial music. If you've ever been inside the Cathedral of San Marco in Venice, you will see that it has two choir lofts, one either side of the building. And from quite early on in the 16th century, they had started developing this style of music whereby the music sort of played ping-pong between the two choirs. The first person to develop this style was a Netherlands composer by the name of Adriaan Willaert, who was the chief musician there from 1527 to 1562. And he wrote these pieces for double choir. It wasn't exclusive to Venice. You will find a number of countries where also other cities as well, where double choir pieces were written. Palestrina in Rome, for instance, has written some double choir pieces, as did Victoria in Spain. But it was the Venetians that really took this antiphonal music to its most grand manifestation, not only having choirs but adding instruments. In fact, sometimes writing antiphonal pieces for two separate instrumental groups, Gabrieli's Sonata Piano e Forte being one such piece, the first known piece that actually specifically mentions dynamics. Piano e Forte meaning soft and loud, and it's the first piece that actually specifies when there should be these different dynamics. He wrote pieces for 3 and 4 choirs, very, very grand, wonderful stuff. So a great person for this young aspiring German composer to study with. He also, though, besides this very grand Venetian style, instilled into Schütz the discipline of the older style, the more conservative, the more contrapuntal style. We heard a little bit of that last time, what might be called the Palestrina style. He was almost seen as the ultimate example of late 16th century counterpoint. So he was taught a more traditional style as well as this more grand, quite contemporary style. Gabrieli's music was actually beginning to change in about 1605, 1606. He was starting to write independent instrumental parts in his choral pieces, rather than just having music where the instruments might occasionally double the voice parts, or in fact sometimes might replace the voice parts. Anyway, the fruits of his study came out in 1611 in this publication here. Canto il primo libro di madrigali di Enrico Sagittario Alemanno, the first book of madrigals by Heinrich Schütz, the German. It's interesting that he's Italianised his name, Enrico Sagittario. Had he come to England, he'd have called himself Henry Archer. That's what his name means. But no one came to England for music in those days. Our day as being the leading influence in the world had been gone by about 150 years. Only really from about Agincourt to middle of the 15th century was English music really seen as the thing. Italy was definitely the place to be in the early 17th century. And this book of madrigals was very well received, and several people said it's a shame. It's the first one. It's a pity there never was a second. It's interesting if you listen to these pieces. They're in Italian, but the distinctives of Schütz's style are quite apparent even in these pieces, which are Italian secular pieces. And if we could move on to the next slide. And this is what Schütz said about his teacher. What a man he was. After I'd been but a short time with my teacher, I found out how important and difficult was the study of compositions, and I realised that I still had a poor foundation in it. From this time on, I put away all my previous studies and devoted myself to the study of music alone. Upon the publication of my first humble work, Giovanni Gabrieli urged me with great warmth to continue the study of music. Schütz was his favourite pupil. He invited Schütz to live with him in his house in Venice. Gabrieli never married, and actually, as I said, he was in very poor health at this time, and he handed Schütz his signet ring as a token of their friendship. They got on extremely well. Some commentators have interpreted this as a wish on Gabrieli's part that Schütz should succeed him in this very prestigious position as the leading organist in Venice, in St. Mark's Cathedral, Venice. But Schütz, clearly his roots were in Germany, and that's where he returns. Now, if we could, next slide. Now, this is a very interesting piece. It's down in the SWV catalogue, if we can see it here, perhaps it isn't on that slide. The SWV stands for Schutzwerke Verzeichnis, I think, which means list of works by Schütz. But in fact, it seems to be nothing more than an arrangement of a piece by Gabrieli. I've listened to the Gabrieli piece, and quite honestly, I can't tell the difference. I don't know quite what he did, whether he just copied it out and made a few tweaks. But it does sound more like Gabrieli than Schütz. Not just because it's in Latin. I've heard pieces by Schütz which are in Latin. He wrote a setting of David's Lament for Absalom, which I mentioned last time was a very popular text at this time, in Latin, and that sounds like Schütz. But this, to me, sounds very much like Gabrieli. But there's a very good reason, or two good reasons for including this. Firstly, it's very significant. It's a setting of one of the Psalms, or the first few verses from the Psalm. The Psalms were to be very much part of Schütz, a very important part of his musical output right throughout his life. And secondly, it'll be very interesting to compare this piece, which, as I said, sounds very much like Gabrieli rather than Schütz, with a setting of the psalm by Schütz a few years later. So let's hear this first piece, Cantate Domino. Seems to have a slight technical glitch. Worked fine a few minutes ago. although obviously we've got the one speaker, I hope you perhaps could hear from that how there's this sort of ping-pong effect. One choir, then another choir, then another choir, then another choir. So that's the sort of music that would have greeted young Schütz when he went off to Venice to study. Anyway, as I said, Gabrieli died in 1612, so back he went to Germany, back he went to Kassel, and after all that you thought, well, he was set to be a composer, there just couldn't be anything else. But no, he ended up going back to his law studies, although he continued to be the organist for Landgrave Moritz. But he was soon to move to the place with which he is to be associated, the city of Dresden. He was headhunted by the Elector Johann Georg I and was given a permanent post in the Electoral Chapel in Dresden in 1617. So his association with Dresden was to last for 55 years, on and off with a few gaps. Now something very interesting happened in 1619. He had a most unusual wedding celebration. He married his young bride, Magdalena Wildeck, and combines the wedding festivities with the launch of one of his greatest works, the most extraordinary thing to do at your wedding. But that's what he did, and in 1619 he came out with his Opus 2, the Psalms of David. I don't want to play it quite yet, but let's move over to the next slide. Now, before we listen to this piece, there's a couple of things to point out. It is, again, another double choir piece with this ping-pong effect between the two choirs. It also has 5 instrumental parts, which, as I said, is a feature that was beginning to come in with Gabrieli's writing in the early 17th century, although on this occasion the instrumentalists really just appear to double the voice parts, sometimes at an octave, which is quite unusual. If you go back to the 16th century, that wouldn't have happened. But again, things are beginning to change in the music world. And another thing that's very interesting is that Schütz starts to do something which wouldn't have happened in the 16th century, which is to use word painting, where a certain musical phrase tries to depict a certain object. I think it's very interesting that in this piece, when Psalm 8, of course, mentions the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, and it's quite interesting that you might just be able to catch it, that when this piece comes in here, it goes something like this, Die Monde und die Sterne. And if you were to listen to the Christmas story, which we'll hear a bit of later on, we won't do this particular bit of the Christmas story, but where the wise men and the star appears, we actually have this Sterne is actually used again. It's sort of little, what 200 years later under Wagner would be called a leitmotif, where you actually associate a musical phrase with a particular subject. I don't know quite how that associates with a star, but certainly Schütz seemed to think so. When you get to the fish in the sea, you might also recognise that as being rather appropriately portrayed musically. The other thing that's worth noticing with this piece is that Schütz had taken his studies to heart with Gabrieli, but somehow had internalised it and adapted this grand Venetian style to the German language. You can hear Gabrieli's influence, you can hear the double choir, but it sounds very different because he's writing in German. He's an excellent setter of his mother tongue. So without more ado, let's hear Schütz's setting of Psalm 8, Herr unser Herrscher. There's quite a number of psalm settings in the Simon David's collection of 1619, and they are all absolutely wonderful pieces. Quite interesting that I mentioned in the last lecture how percussion parts were never written. One of the earliest examples of a written percussion part is his setting of Psalm 136, where it actually has written out parts for kettle drums. Just one other thing about the instruments while we're on the subject of instruments, in that you might want to know what are those instruments you could hear. They are basically cornets and sackbuts. The sackbut is essentially a trombone, but without such a wide bell as the modern trombone. Still make a jolly decent sound, but not as loud as modern trombone can. The cornet has a wooden body, not quite like a recorder. It sort of goes like this, and it has a brass mouthpiece. And they were often used in combination. And the Germans in particular were quite fond of using brass instruments. A lot of the big towns and cities had what were called Stadtpfeifer, who were basically the town wind players. Anyway, shall we now move on to the next slide? So this very grand Venetian music was adapted by Schütz. He wasn't the first person to do it. There had been earlier polychoral German pieces, but he was certainly one of the leading exponents of it. But sadly, the opportunity to produce more music on this scale was denied to him because of the 30 Years' War. I mentioned that Landgrave Moritz became a Calvinist, and that Calvinists didn't really have any legal status within Germany, and that was one of the factors that led to the 30 Years' War. It's rather like the First World War. All sorts of things just came together. It's quite a complex series of events, but it devastated parts of Germany. Some cities that were quite substantial, Magdeburg, for instance, which isn't a major city now, was actually really important, but absolutely wrecked because of this war between Catholic and Protestants. It changed from just being a question mark about the state of Calvinists to a much wider conflict. The Holy Roman Emperor being a Catholic on one side, and various people allied against him during the course of the years. The Swedish king Gustav Adolphus, who was a great military leader and a very fine Christian, actually came in to defend the Protestants at one stage. Scottish mercenaries fought in this war on the Protestant side and gained some good military experience when it came to 10 years later to our own civil war. And eventually the French, who were concerned about the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, although they were Catholics, intervened on the same side as the Protestants. A very complex war, a very sad event that left Germany devastated and may well have been a reason why it didn't become a political unit until quite a long time later. But one result of it, one very immediate effect, is that the sorts of resources that you needed to perform the grand works like the Psalm Davids were no longer available. Schütz himself wrote in 1636, which was in the middle of this war, the laudable art of music has not only greatly declined, but in some places has been completely abandoned. And besides this national tragedy, which was obviously going to affect him in his career, he suffered a personal tragedy when his young wife died after only 6 years of marriage at the age of 24. Now, of course, in those days, it was quite not much more common for people to die in their 20s, to die young. There were far more things that could kill people, from diseases and so forth, dying in childbirth, etc., etc. But let's not forget that these people were human. It would have hurt him very greatly to have seen this tragedy. By all accounts, he was a very gentle, a very pleasant, quiet man, and would have been very seriously grieved to have lost his wife at such a young age. But the great thing is, besides being able to write this very grand music, he was also the master of small-scale music as well. And it's a piece like this that makes me so convinced, even though we don't have his testimony of how he became a Christian, that there was a very real faith within Heinrich Schütz. I mean, who else would set a passage like this apart from a Christian? This vibe, was weinest du, woman, why weepest thou? This is the dialogue between Jesus and Mary Magdalene at the tomb. It's a wonderful piece of music, and basically the two lower parts, the tenors and the bass, take the part of Jesus, and the sopranos and the altos, I think it's actually sung by soloists in this recording, take the part of Mary Magdalene. And you have this dialogue where the bass is saying, "Woman, why weepest thou?" And the females say, because they left, you know the passage very well, because they've taken my Lord away. And then this wonderful moment, obviously in German, so it's Maria rather than Mary, most extraordinary harmonic progression. I mean, how else? How can you musically put something like that into music? He does a wonderful job of it. And then it goes on, "I shall ascend unto my Father and to your God." And it's interesting that the men just bring this piece to a close, and it's an ascending phrase musically to describe the word ascend. Shall we now hear it? It's this word painting, this use of trying to use a certain musical phrase to depict something very characteristic of Schütz, and certainly of the Baroque period, of which he was one of the earliest prominent composers. So let's now move on to the next slide. And here's a very interesting thing. He lived to a great age, as we've noted, but how much music did he write? A lot of it seems to have been lost. He certainly was a pioneer in many ways. The first Protestant funeral music was a piece he wrote for a noble friend of his in 1636, and actually I believe it's a nobleman himself, who was quite a strong Christian, who chose the text. But interestingly enough, over 250 or so years later, or roughly that period, these texts were very influential, and in fact Schütz's piece was quite influential on Brahms when he wrote his Deutsches Requiem all that time later. So that survived. Lots of his stuff has survived, and some quite pioneering music. But what else could he have written that has just disappeared? One of the first tasks he was given in Dresden was when the member of the Holy Roman Emperor's family visited the city, and he was meant to write a lavish ballet. Music's lost. He wrote the first German opera, Daphne, in 1627. Both the music and the libretto lost. He wrote the music for the marriage of the son of the Elector, Johann Georg II. Music lost. And this is perhaps the biggest mystery of all. You may have noticed that the organ is shut. You may have noticed I'm not wearing my organ shoes. I'd love to have played you some organ music by Heinrich Schütz. I've loved his choral music, as I said, since I was at school. I'm sure if he wrote anything for the organ, I'd have loved playing it. But we don't even know whether he wrote any. It's a strange mystery. Certainly nothing survives, even though he was renowned as one of the finest organists in Germany. In fact, very, very little instrumental-only music by him actually survives. He wrote the setting of the 7 last words from the cross, and that begins with an instrumental prelude. And that is the only purely instrumental piece by him that is known to have survived. So we don't know what else has been lost, but we're thankful that quite a lot has survived. The other interesting thing is that there's no evidence of him using the chorale in part of his work, at least the chorale melodies. Those of you who were here last time, I mentioned the chorale, which is basically the German hymn tune. Very much part of the music of a lot of composers, German composers, right up to J.S. Bach. But not Schütz. Sometimes he did set chorale texts, but he always set them basically as what we would call anthems. There's no evidence of the chorale actually being much of an influence on his music. He did set some psalms. Besides the grand settings, he also wrote some very simple 4-part settings. As I said, the psalms were very much part of his musical life right throughout his long career. But as I've said, how much else there is of his which has disappeared and never to be found again, we don't know. I'll mention one piece later on, which I was told when I was at university has disappeared and was destroyed because Dresden, as you may know, was one of the cities that was bombed by the Allies in 1945, and I was told this particular piece had been lost, but apparently it hasn't been, because I shall mention it even though we won't actually hear anything from it. We'll hear a similar piece that's part of the same publication later on. But certainly, yes, there's a lot of pieces that we will never know whether, quite what became of them. But let's now move on to the next slide. He never remarried, so he spent 47 years as a widower, and he decided he'd made a vow before God to spend the rest of his life composing church music. He remained Kapellmeister in Dresden until 1657. He had that official position, but sometimes because of the war, he moved away. He spent some time in Copenhagen. And sadly, besides losing his wife, he also saw both of his daughters die. One in 1638, she'd have probably been about in her teens then, the other one 1655, so perhaps about 30 by then. But obviously, a very sad life in some ways for this man, man with a very gentle spirit. But he didn't let these sad events put him off. He continued to live a very active life right to the end. That's another portrait which is reputed to be of him, but apparently it's very dubious. It's by Rembrandt, but it's more than likely or not that it actually isn't, although it is actually used sometimes in say LPs or CDs these days of his music. Now, he made another visit to Venice in 1628. There's San Marco, the cathedral, and the famous Campanile just outside it. And the man he went to see was Claudio Monteverdi. Gabrieli's was the organist, that was his official position. Monteverdi was Maestro di Cappella, which basically corresponds to the German Kapellmeister, so slightly different role, but essentially Gabrieli was the leading composer, Monteverdi became the leading composer in spite of having a different title and a different role. A very influential figure. Monteverdi being the first person to write an opera that works and is still in the repertoire. Monteverdi's Orfeo 1607 still gets the odd performance today. I heard it when I was at university. In fact, his last works also, or last works of note, were operas as well. In Coronazione di Popper in 1642. In fact, by that time, Venice had become the first place to have a public opera house. He was also a prolific writer of church music. His Vespers of 1610, wonderful piece of music. And in Venice, he wrote a number of pieces really right throughout his 30 years there. And Monteverdi was a real pioneer, and it's not surprising that Schütz wanted to go and meet him and learn from him. We don't have much details about that visit. We can be fairly confident they probably did meet, but how much time they spent together we don't know. But certainly this visit to Venice and this meeting with Monteverdi and hearing his music did have an influence on his music. This piece in particular, you will hear the Monteverdi influence. I don't know if any of you know the piece Beata Sphere, one of the most famous of Monteverdi's later works, where we move away from having equal voices sort of moving round each other, which is a typical late Renaissance 16th century model of church music, to having things very much in pairs. You'll have a pair of sopranos, a pair perhaps of tenors, and often a pair of violins. And this so-called concertato style was something that Schütz very much has been influenced by in this particular piece. Another text which says to me, would a non-Christian write a piece like this? Saul, Saul, was verfolgst du mich? It's the conversion of Paul. It's the words, Acts 9:4-5. It's simply the words of Jesus. That's all you have. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Obviously, Saul only heard one voice. We've got a 6-part choir here. It's a very dramatic piece. You can sort of imagine it echoing across the rocks as he was on the road to Damascus. Let's now hear it. I'm slightly jumping the gun. That piece was published in 1650. Now, you may remember when we mentioned the 30 Years' War that I said it started in 1618. So by 1650, the war was over. And one result of that was that the German courts were able to take on more musicians. And so Schütz was able now to write pieces on a slightly larger scale. And here is one particularly lovely piece. I think this one came out in 1649. It's in 6 parts. It's a setting of the first 3 verses from Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. Die Himmel erzählen die Ehre Gottes. And this one, as I said, doesn't have independent instrumental parts, but in this particular recording, instruments are doubled at times, which was still a practice. They may not have necessarily had their own parts, but it was quite common to double up the voice parts with instruments at certain key moments. As I said, it's not as grand perhaps as the 1619 pieces, but certainly for Germans at this time an encouragement that maybe they could start having more musicians in their courts, and Schütz was there to provide it. Just to mention at the end that you do get the doxology. It's just like some of our choral pieces end with glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Ghost. This is quite common in German choral music as well, and you will actually get this at the end of this particular piece, just to avoid any confusion. Yes. course, by the time the war had ended, Schütz was in his 60s, which obviously wasn't a bad age for those days. He did a lot in the early 1650s to help other musical establishments get themselves going again after the war. And in 1657, a change of elector, he asked if he could retire, by which time he'd reached the age of 72. He returned to his childhood home in Weissenfels, and he shared a house with his sister. But he wasn't actually to be allowed to retire. The new elector kept calling him back to Dresden. He kept wanting him to come and write more music. And we can be very thankful that in spite of Schütz's desire to call it a day, because he was feeling his age, he was starting to get a bit deaf and starting to lose his sight. I don't think there's any evidence that he went completely deaf like Beethoven, but certainly his faculties weren't what they were. But he continued, besides this involvement with other musical establishments, he actually continued to compose and wrote some of his finest pieces in the 1660s. There's a picture of him dating from 1660, by which time he was 75. You can see a rather careworn face, the personal tragedies he'd had, losing his wife, losing his two daughters, certainly shows that he's had a hard life. But for all that, he was able to produce this wonderful music in the final decade of his life. And this, I must admit, is one of my personal favourites. I've just loved this piece ever since I first heard it. It's a setting of the Christmas story. It's almost all the verses, the relevant verses from Luke chapter 2 and Matthew chapter 2, verses we're so familiar with. We'll be reading them out in our carol service set to music. And how does it work? It's basically sort of oratorio style. Now, you may have noticed in several of the pieces, for instance, the second piece we heard, Was Feines du, besides the singers, there's also this organ accompaniment. It's a very pronounced feature of Baroque music, and it's known as a continuo. What's happened is that the composer would write out the bass line, and with these numbers underneath, which is known as a figured bass. The bottom line, that line there, will be doubled by a melody instrument, a viola da gamba, perhaps later on a cello, maybe a bassoon or a trombone, but more likely a stringed instrument. And from these numbers, they would fill in the harmony, these numbers indicating what chords were to be played. In this recording, it will be on an organ. Sometimes it was done on a theorbo, which is a great long thing, rather like a guitar with a very, very long neck. And this idea of a figured bass and this idea of accompanying singers with instruments like that was very much part of oratorio, as well as the sort of motets, anthems, whatever you want to call them, we've heard tonight, and also in opera. And how Schütz handles the text is that all the bits that we call narrative, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the days of Herod the King, that would be sung by someone that's in church music, always known as the evangelist. The music is fairly straightforward. We're just trying to get through the music, to get through the text. Although sometimes it can actually be very beautiful. When we get to the passage, I'm afraid there's only going to be a short extract tonight. I would recommend hearing this entire piece. This is absolutely lovely. But where's that passage about the massacre of the innocents, where you hear how Herod killed them all? And then there's that quotation from Jeremiah about Rachel mourning for her children because they're none. It is very, very moving. Even though it's just recitative, that's what you call when you have the narrator just going through the bits of the text. But the bits that do lend themselves to either to a choir or to a soloist are set in a similar style to opera. You have these arias for a soloist, and you have the choruses. And the selection from this lovely piece that we're going to hear is the angels, where you have firstly the appearance of the angels. I'll just read you the text out so that you know where we're at. It's that familiar passage in Luke, the appearance of the angels to the shepherds. As I said, I'd love for us to hear more, but obviously we've got to think about the time. So what you'll be hearing, assuming I've got the cut-in point correctly, is this bit here. And there in the same country, shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by light. And lo, you'll know when the lo comes bit, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, and then we have fear not, that's sung by, angels are always sopranos, aren't they? That's sung by the angel, fear not, and so forth. For unto you is born this day a Saviour who is Christ the Lord, etc., etc. And then we have another bit of recitative, and suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly hosts praising God and saying. Then we have the chorus, glory to God. Gott in der Höhe. It's not as dramatic as Handel, Messiah, where he brings in the trumpets, but it's still a lovely setting. We have the 2 violins and a 6-part choir. So let's enjoy this setting of the Christmas story. was written when he was 75. It was published 4 years later. You might think, well, okay, fair enough. He's had a good innings. But he still had some more music up his sleeve. Would you believe it? In his 80s, he wrote a setting of the entire of Psalm 119. When I was at university, I was told this was a piece that had been lost because of Allied bombing, but obviously hadn't been, because it is actually available. You can listen to it in bits, rather like, you know, churches that sing psalms. They break it up into sections of 8 verses, and Schütz's setting of it likewise breaks it up into self-contained bits. I think the whole psalm is about an hour and a half if you were to listen to it right through. But the very last piece he wrote, it's quite remarkable. Very few composers wrote great music in their 80s. Some of them, obviously, lost them, didn't reach that age. Sibelius, who was 92 when he died, actually stopped composing about 30 years before then. The only other 2 composers of real note who've written great music in their 80s were Verdi, who I don't think he wrote an opera after 1893 when he was 80, but he did write 4 sacred songs when he was 84. And the other one is Vaughan Williams. It shows how long our late Queen reigned, when he was actually involved at the age of 81 in the music for her coronation. And he also wrote his 8th and 9th symphonies in his 80s, the 9th being completed in 1958 when he was approaching the age of 86. Now, Schütz's last piece, his Schwanengesang, his swan song, very interestingly, almost the wheel goes full circle. You think of those studies with Gabrielli in Venice and the double choir technique that he would have assimilated, and he would have obviously remembered those grand pieces he heard in Venice. The last piece he wrote when he was 84 is a setting of the Magnificat in German for double choir. What I find very interesting about this, I'm perhaps letting my imagination run away with me, but maybe not too much. You consider how grand some of his music was, such a gentle person that he was by nature. But the ending of this piece, the Amen at the end, is actually quite serene and not as grand as you'd expect from a double choir piece of music. I like to imagine this is Schütz saying, I've had a long life, it's been a hard life, I've served my God faithfully with my music, I'm ready to go. Let's hear Deutsches Magnificat. It's a wonderful note to bow out on. He died 3 years after writing that piece and a year after it was published, and this was the epitaph that was written. I don't think it was actually on his tombstone. I think it was written in the church in Dresden, where he was so much, that city where he was, so strongly connected. The Christian singer of psalms, a joy for foreigners, for Germans alike. Anyway, thank you for coming, and do come again 2 weeks' time, where we'll be looking at the life, music and faith of George Friedrich Handel. Thank you very much.